Welcome to our Back to the Future interview series. In this series, we interview client-side professionals from around the world, and together we discover what the future might hold. Today, my colleague in our New York office, Jeff Haselum, one of our client partners, is interviewing Tina Tonielli, and she is the America's lead Consumer Business Insights and Analytics at GSK.
Tina, thank you so much for joining me today to have this chat, and we've got a couple of things that I would just love to pick your brains on and get some of your thoughts about, if possible. So the first thing I want to ask you about is we have a sort of one of the key statements that you selected as that we should talk about today, and it is all around our consumer insights gathered before COVID-19 outbreak relevant today, and essentially has foresight become more important than insight, and how does that interplay of primary data with data analytics? What is the sweet spot? So I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So I think as I look at data gathered before COVID and the outbreak, I think you kind of have to look at it with a grain of salt, but it is an important grain of salt. So the way I look at it, we've been using it a ton when we are forecasting. So we're trying to forecast our expected sales for next year, as an example. Yeah. And so, in the past, predictive analytics and building models really hot in our industry. And I think it's impossible to have a predictive model now because no model would have predicted COVID. And so all the models have broken. And so you have to look at things differently, and you have to be a whole lot more creative in how you approach things than we ever have before. So I think the fusing of art and science is really how we need to be thinking about things now more than ever. I think we've always fused art and science a bit, but I think there's been a trend towards more of the science and more of the data and more of the predictive analytics and less of the art over the last couple of years. And I think, to me, what COVID has really taught us is that criticality of fusing the two, of fusing the art and the science together. So for example, when we look at forecasting, we're looking at trends that were prior to COVID, and we're bringing the art in to say, how do we think those trends are going to continue going forward? So do we think they're going to continue at the same level? Do we think that they're going to decline? What are the signals that we would look at from prior to COVID that would make us think that they might continue or not? And it's a lot of talking to consumers, listening to consumers, yep, inferring what they mean by what they say. And that's where a lot of the art comes in.
You made that sound really simple, but I don't think it is that simple, is it? How do you even go about putting that together? Like, what's been involved to try and get essentially people, I would imagine, that really love data, and then people that are probably much more on that qualitative, talking to consumers, and how do you put that together?
So we do a couple of things, I would say. So I look at my forecasting team. I have sort of a couple of disciplines that come into the forecasting team naturally. I have some really strong financial background folks, and I have some really strong analytical folks. I also have within my broader team some really strong consumer insights folks who come in and sort of challenge assumptions. And then the way we've built forecasts is we look at things from a trending perspective, sort of do the math, if you think about it. And then we look at it from a consumer behavioral perspective, and you gut check your assumptions and say, what would need to be true from a consumer behavior perspective to support the math that you're doing? And then you say, does that make sense? And then the consumer insights folks would come in and say, based on what I'm seeing and hearing from a consumer, do I think that that's right? Do I think that that behavior that needs to happen to support your math would actually be true? And so to me, it's when you bring all those disciplines together that you can stand behind the forecast and say, I think that's as right as one can possibly be today, because we know we're going to be wrong. Nobody is possibly going to be right. If they're going to be right, they're, millionaires, billionaires probably. So we're all going to be wrong, but it's about having assumptions that we can all feel good about. And to me, the best assumptions are ones that you've come at multiple different ways. And so that's how we're coming at them multiple different ways.
So you're almost a conductor of a very large and eclectic orchestra of
yes,
insights.
We're making beautiful music, or maybe not beautiful music sometimes, but it's great.
So would you say you're more willing then to rip up those assumptions more quickly than ever before, just because things are so volatile at the moment? Is that kind of the mindset right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of the way we're looking at it is documenting your assumptions, making sure that you're really clear on what your assumptions are going forward, and then looking at those assumptions against what's actually happening. And so on a more frequent basis, that iteration. So you hear a lot when you talk about agility about iteration and iterative. And I think for us, iterative is not just random. Iterative is really clear documentation of what your assumptions are. And then the iterativeness is, what have I learned against what my assumptions were, and then constantly updating your assumptions. But again, that updating of your assumptions isn't just one person sitting in a back room running a model. It's having those multiple pieces coming together saying, what are we hearing from consumers? What is the math telling us? What are the financials telling us? And bringing those pieces all together to challenge the assumptions on a regular basis.
And then, of course, weaving that into a narrative or a story that the business can understand, which again, you made that sound really simple, but I know it's not. So
yeah, sure.
Okay, well one of the points you mentioned in there as well is around your consumer insights folks, so those guys being really strong and challenging those assumptions against math and the science and everything else. I think one of the other statements I wanted to talk to you about was this idea that we are more consumer centric than ever before, due to, we're now in sort of COVID times, and I think many of us were expecting to be out of that by now, which obviously is one of the key things that we're challenging. But imagining that time going forward when we are through the pandemic or life becomes back to normal, how do we take the best parts of how consumer centric we've been right now and keep those for when we come out of lockdown? Do you think we're forever changed in InSites that would be the case? What do you think the future looks like?
So I think a couple of things. I think one is, how do we keep talking to consumers on a more regular basis about things in their life? Because I think what we tend to do is we get really focused on specific questions that we have of consumers that are really specific to our products or really specific to micro aspects of our category. So, hey, I want to understand this specific product in this specific usage occasion and exactly how much of this specific ingredient I should use for this specific product, or what word I should use to talk about it. So we get really, really deep in our conversations with consumers. I think what we have done a really nice job of over the last couple of months is get really connected to consumers about their lives and not about us. So it's more about them and it's less about us. And the necessity of understanding the context that consumers are using our products in their lives was necessary because their lives changed so dramatically that the context of our products changed so dramatically. So everything you thought you knew about our products had to change because the context of their lives changed, and it changed overnight, and it changed for every one of our categories. So it was sort of a great unifying principle, or a great unifying question that we had for every single one of our categories. I think what we have to think about is, how do we still think about those questions about the context of consumers' lives for our categories going forward? And it probably won't be going and talking to them every couple of weeks like we did probably during the last couple of months. But how do we think about, on a quarterly basis or an annual basis, really taking a big step out of our funnel up to the higher level and understanding the context of consumers' lives? Because to be fair, they actually don't care that much about the ingredients of our toothpastes or the names or the words that we choose to use to talk about our products. But there are things that they really care about: the health of our nation, the health of our economy, that influences how they think about our products. And if we don't understand the context of how they think about our products, we're occasionally going to be super tone deaf in talking about our products. So I think it's important to understand the context of their lives and keep in touch with consumers in that way, because I actually don't think we're going to come out of this in 6 months. I actually just had a conversation with consumers yesterday with our general manager in the United States. And, you know, one consumer said, I don't think we're going to go back to normal until 5 years from now. Another consumer said at least 2 years from now. So I think, you know, when we all started lockdown back in March, we thought, oh, it'll be a couple of months. Oh, we'll be fine by the summer. Oh, we'll be fine by December. I don't think we're going to be, quote, normal for quite a while. And I think then when we are normal, how do we challenge ourselves to maintain that connection to context, I think would be the thing for us.
I think it's a good question and something to keep asking ourselves over that time. But if I just pick up on one of the points, I mean, I think, you know, working with you and with the team, I know there are a lot of tactical questions right now. Like, people want to know what's happening here and what's happened to my category, and can we say this and can we not say this, and everything else. But I think what you're describing is more that macro level, you know, staying on top of and just being aware of everything around us. Like, but how do you think that's changed in the shift of what's expected from an insights professional, that they are going to have to be much more macro focused and themed in the future than ever before? And is there time to do that as well as a day job?
You know, it's interesting because I think that, you know, I've talked to some other industry folks over the last couple of weeks, and I think that when macro crises happen, there's an expectation of insights professionals to understand that macro context. If you're not in a macro crisis, there's not an expectation from our commercial partners for insights professionals to have that macro context. So the drive to understand that macro context is actually going to have to come from the insights professionals versus outside of the insights function. And I think that's harder because we have so many pressures coming to us from our commercial partners all the time. This new product, that new product, how do we grow this business? What do we do about that that's further down the funnel? The pressure of the macro comes when there's a macro crisis.
Yeah.
And so if we're in a normal state, it's going to be harder for an insights professional to be driving an agenda of macro context because there's not going to be the pressure from the outside. But I think that it's an important thing for us to keep thinking about how we can do it. We're going to have to do it efficiently from a financial perspective, and we're going to have to do it efficiently from a capacity perspective, because the other pressures aren't going to go away.
No, I mean, you say external partners, but I would imagine internal partners as well, because the insights professionals have to speak to marketing and to commercial and
for me, when I say external, I mean outside of our function.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry. When I say external, I meant outside of our function. So our internal partners to the company, but outside of our function. Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I guess now is the time to be more consumer centric in the organization and to show the power of that narrative. And that's what's important now. Well, Tina, I could probably talk to you all day. I won't, I promise. But I just want to say thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I think this interview was a nice illustration of the quote by David Jones: "We need to move from marketing to consumers to mattering to people." Brands and companies need to try to be relevant in the lives of their consumers, of their customers. And if they want to do that, they need to very actively listen to their consumers and customers. And they need to immerse into their lives to understand how their products and services can be meaningful, can play that role.